The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Roosevelt High School, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floors. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses and smoothed the front of her modest cardigan as she walked through the empty hallway. At 53 years old, she had spent nearly 3 decades teaching English literature at this school, watching generations of students pass through her classroom doors. Her shoes made soft clicking sounds against the floor as she approached her classroom, room 214, the same room she'd occupied since 1995, back when the walls were freshly painted and the desks didn't wobble. Now, the paint was chipped, the heating barely worked in winter, and half her textbooks were held together with tape and determination. But Margaret didn't mind. She had never been in this profession for the facilities or the paycheck. She was here for the students, for the look in their eyes when Shakespeare suddenly made sense, when a poem clicked, when they discovered that literature wasn't just old words on a page, but a mirror reflecting their own lives. She unlocked her classroom door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old books and chalk dust. On her desk sat a stack of essays she had graded over the weekend, each one covered in her careful handwriting, filled with encouragement and constructive feedback. She believed every student deserved her full attention, regardless of their grades or background. The intercom crackled to life, startling her from her morning routine. "Mrs. Chen, please report to Principal Davidson's office immediately." Margaret frowned. It was barely 7:30. School didn't start for another hour. In all her years of teaching, she had rarely been summoned like this, and never at such an early hour. She set down her bag, straightened her cardigan once more, and made her way toward the administrative wing. The administrative offices of Roosevelt High had recently been renovated. New carpet, fresh paint, modern furniture. It was a stark contrast to the classrooms where teachers had been requesting basic repairs for years. Margaret couldn't help but notice the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall, displaying the school's logo in rotating colors. She approached the secretary's desk, where a young woman named Patricia was typing rapidly on a computer. "Good morning, Patricia. I was called to see Principal Davidson." Patricia looked up, and Margaret noticed something in her expression. Pity, perhaps, or discomfort. "Yes, Mrs. Chen, he's expecting you. You can go right in." Margaret knocked twice on the heavy wooden door before entering. Principal Harold Davidson sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was a relatively new addition to the school, having arrived just 2 years ago after the previous principal retired. He was younger than Margaret, maybe mid-40s, with slicked-back hair and expensive suits that seemed out of place in a public school setting. But he wasn't alone. Sitting in the leather chairs facing the desk were 3 other people. Margaret recognized Superintendent Victoria Blackwell immediately, a severe woman with steel-grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. Beside her sat Gerald Foster, the school board's legal counsel, a thin man with nervous eyes. The third person was a younger woman Margaret didn't recognize, taking notes on a tablet. "Ah, Margaret, please, have a seat." Davidson gestured toward an empty chair positioned in front of his desk, facing the entire group like a defendant before a tribunal. Margaret sat down slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. "What's this about, Harold?" "It's Principal Davidson," he corrected, his tone sharp. "And this is about your future at Roosevelt High." Superintendent Blackwell leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, we've received several complaints about your teaching methods." Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped beneath her. "Complaints? From whom?" "That's confidential," Gerald Foster said quickly, "but we take these matters very seriously." "What kind of complaints?" Margaret pressed, trying to keep her voice steady. Davidson opened a manila folder on his desk, making a show of flipping through papers. "It says here that you've been teaching outside the approved curriculum, introducing materials that haven't been vetted by the school board. I supplement the curriculum with additional literature to enrich my students' understanding. That's standard practice for experienced teachers." Not without approval, Blackwell said coldly. Every text must be approved by the curriculum committee. With all due respect, Superintendent, the curriculum committee hasn't met in 18 months, and the approved textbooks are over 15 years old. Some of them reference events that happened before my current students were born. Davidson's eyes narrowed. Are you criticizing the school board's decisions, Mrs. Chen? I'm explaining the reality of teaching in this school. A reality that you might understand better if you ever visited an actual classroom. The words were out before Margaret could stop them. She watched Davidson's face flush red, his jaw tightening. That's exactly the kind of attitude that's been reported, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Insubordination, refusal to follow protocol, creating a hostile environment for administrators. Hostile environment? Margaret laughed, a sound without humor. I've dedicated 30 years to this school. I've taught thousands of students. Many of them have gone on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers themselves. And you're accusing me of creating a hostile environment because I want my students to read actual literature. The young woman with the tablet was typing furiously, not looking up. Blackwell exchanged a glance with Davidson before speaking. Mrs. Chen, we're also concerned about your use of school resources. What resources? I buy most of my own supplies because the school budget never covers what we actually need. You've been using the copy machine excessively, Davidson said, reading from the folder, printing hundreds of pages of unauthorized materials. Poetry, short stories, supplementary readings for my students, things they can't afford to buy, things that aren't in our outdated textbooks. Unauthorized materials, Davidson repeated. Do you understand how this looks? A teacher using school resources for her own purposes, teaching whatever she wants, ignoring the established curriculum. Margaret stood up, her hands trembling. What I understand is that I'm being ambushed. You called me here without any warning, without any opportunity to prepare, to face accusations that I wasn't even aware existed. This isn't a meeting, this is a trial. Sit down, Mrs. Chen. Blackwell's voice was ice. No, not until someone tells me what's really going on here. Davidson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. What's really going on is that Roosevelt High is entering a new era. The school board has approved a comprehensive restructuring plan. We're modernizing, bringing in new teaching methodologies, new performance metrics, and unfortunately, some of the old guard simply doesn't fit into our vision for the future. Margaret felt her blood run cold. Old guard? You're 53 years old, Mrs. Chen. Your methods are outdated. Your resistance to change is well documented, and frankly, your salary is significantly higher than what we'd pay a newer teacher with fresh ideas and modern training. So this is about money. This is about what's best for the students, Blackwell said, but her eyes told a different story. Gerald Foster cleared his throat. Mrs. Chen, we're offering you an opportunity. Early retirement, full pension benefits, a clean separation. It's more than fair, given the circumstances. Given what circumstances? Fabricated complaints, accusations without evidence? The complaints are documented, Davidson said, patting the folder. And there will be a formal review process during which you'll be placed on administrative leave. Of course, that information tends to become public. Parents talk. Students notice when their teacher suddenly disappears. These things can be damaging to a reputation. Margaret stared at him, finally understanding. This wasn't about her teaching methods or unauthorized copies. This was a calculated campaign to force her out. And they were betting that she would quietly accept their offer rather than fight and risk public humiliation. Who put you up to this, Harold? She asked quietly. His smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. You've been principal for 2 years. In that time, you've let the building fall apart while renovating your office. You've cut the arts program, reduced library hours, and eliminated 3 teaching positions. Now, you're coming after tenured teachers. Someone is pulling your strings. Who is it? Davidson's face hardened. I think we're done here. You have until Friday to accept our offer. After that, we proceed with the formal review. Patricia will provide you with the paperwork on your way out. And if I refuse both options? Then you'll learn what happens to teachers who think they're above the rules. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Roosevelt High is changing, Mrs. Chen. You can either get on board or get out of the way. Those are your only choices. Margaret picked up her purse and walked to the door. She paused, with her hand on the handle. You know what I've learned in 30 years of teaching, Principal Davidson? That people who think they have all the power often underestimate those who have something more valuable: principles, integrity, and a very long memory. She walked out before he could respond. The hallway seemed longer on the way back to her classroom. Margaret's mind was racing, replaying every word, every implication. They wanted her gone. They had manufactured complaints, threatened her with public humiliation, and offered a buyout that was designed to look generous but would ultimately save them hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next decade. But why her? Why now? She thought about the changes at Roosevelt High over the past 2 years. The budget cuts to programs that served students, while administrators got raises. The mysterious construction contracts that seemed to go to the same company every time. The way Davidson had surrounded himself with yes-men while experienced teachers were quietly encouraged to leave. Margaret had always tried to stay out of politics. She just wanted to teach, but perhaps that was no longer an option. She reached her classroom and found a student waiting outside the door. Marcus Williams, a junior who'd been struggling in her class at the beginning of the semester. He was tall for his age, with serious eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving. Mrs. Chen, you okay? You look kind of pale. Margaret forced a smile. I'm fine, Marcus. What brings you here so early? He held up a book. You said I could borrow this, the one about the guy who fights the system. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Yes, I remember. Did you finish it? Yeah, twice. He looked down at the worn paperback. I didn't think I'd like it, you know. Reading's never really been my thing. But this one, it made me feel stuff. Like angry and sad, but also kind of hopeful. Is that weird? Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were from Marcus's words or the morning's confrontation. That's not weird at all, Marcus. That's exactly what great literature is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you feel things, question things, see the world differently. My mom says you're the first teacher who ever made me care about school. He shuffled his feet, embarrassed by his own sincerity. She wanted me to tell you thanks. Margaret reached out and squeezed his shoulder. Thank you for telling me, Marcus. That means more than you know. After he left, Margaret sat at her desk and stared at the stack of essays. 28 students in her senior English class. 28 young people whose lives she touched every day. How many more would she reach if they forced her out? How many students like Marcus would fall through the cracks? She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a worn address book. It was old-fashioned, she knew, in an age of smartphones and digital contacts. But Margaret had always believed in keeping records. Notes from parent conferences, thank you cards from former students, contact information for everyone she had taught over the past 3 decades. She flipped to a specific page and ran her finger down the list of names. Maybe it was time to make some phone calls. The coffee shop on 5th Street was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon. Margaret sat in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Across from her sat a woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and shrewd eyes hidden behind designer glasses. Maggie Chen. When I saw your name on my phone, I thought I was dreaming. The woman smiled, but there was caution in her expression. It's been what, 15 years? 18, Rachel, since you graduated. I followed your career, though. Stanford Law, federal prosecutor, now partner at Morrison and Associates. I always knew you'd do something remarkable. Rachel Torres shifted in her seat. I owe a lot of that to you. You were the first person who told me I could be anything I wanted. My own family thought I should just get married and have kids. You were brilliant, brilliant. I just helped you see it. So why are we here, Mrs. Chen? Your message said it was urgent. Margaret took a deep breath and told her everything. The ambush meeting, the fabricated complaints, the ultimatum. Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When Margaret finished, Rachel leaned back in her chair. That's textbook constructive dismissal. They're trying to force you out while making it look like your choice. I know what they're doing. What I don't know is why or how to fight it. Fighting it could get ugly. They have resources, lawyers, and they're clearly willing to play dirty. I'm not afraid of ugly. I'm afraid of what happens to my students if people like Davidson get to do whatever they want without consequences. Rachel studied her former teacher for a long moment. You know, most people in your position would just take the buyout, enjoy retirement, let someone else deal with the mess. I'm not most people. A slow smile spread across Rachel's face. No, you're not. You never were. She pulled out her phone and started typing. I need to make some calls, see what we're really dealing with. Can you get me copies of everything? Your personnel file? The complaint documentation, anything they've given you? They haven't given me anything yet. They said the paperwork would be ready by Friday. Then we need to be ready too. Rachel stood up and dropped some bills on the table. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and document everything. Every conversation, every email, every interaction. These people think they're dealing with a scared old teacher who'll go quietly. Let's show them how wrong they are. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Rachel, thank you. Thank me when we win. She paused at the door. And Maggie, you were wrong about one thing. What's that? You said you helped me see that I was brilliant, but what you really taught me was how to fight for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I'm going to enjoy returning the favor. The school board meeting was held in the Roosevelt High Auditorium, a cavernous space with acoustics designed more for drama productions than democratic processes. The board members sat on stage behind a long table, their nameplates gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Margaret sat in the third row, surrounded by a group of people who had answered her calls. Former students, now adults, who had come from across the city to support her. Parents of current students who had heard rumors and wanted answers. A few fellow teachers who risked their own positions by showing up. Principal Davidson stood at the podium, looking less comfortable than usual. Superintendent Blackwell sat at the center of the board table, her expression carefully neutral. The matter before us today, Davidson was saying, is a routine personnel review. Mrs. Margaret Chen has been a teacher at Roosevelt High for nearly 30 years. However, recent concerns about her adherence to curriculum standards and professional conduct have necessitated this formal process. Point of order. Rachel Torres stood up from her seat beside Margaret. She was dressed in a power suit that screamed expensive lawyer, and her voice carried to every corner of the auditorium. My name is Rachel Torres, and I'm legal counsel for Mrs. Chen. Before we proceed, I'd like to establish some facts for the record. Davidson's eyes widened. This isn't that kind of meeting, Ms. Torres. It's a personnel review, not a courtroom. Then you won't mind answering a few questions. Rachel walked forward, not waiting for permission. Principal Davidson, you claim there have been complaints about Mrs. Chen's teaching. Can you tell us who filed these complaints? That's confidential. Of course it is. Can you tell us when these complaints were filed? Davidson shuffled through his papers. Over the past several months. That's interesting, because I submitted a Freedom of Information request yesterday, and I discovered that all 5 complaints against Mrs. Chen were filed within a 48-hour period, just 2 weeks ago, all from email addresses that don't correspond to any parent or student in the school district. Care to explain that? Murmurs rippled through the audience. Blackwell leaned forward, whispering urgently to Gerald Foster. There must be some administrative error, Davidson said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Perhaps. Let's talk about the curriculum concerns then. Rachel held up a stack of papers. I have here letters from 47 former students of Mrs. Chen. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, business owners. Every single one credits her teaching with changing their lives. I also have letters from current parents praising her dedication and expressing concern about the direction of this school under your leadership. This is irregular, Blackwell interrupted. The board hasn't approved these materials for submission. I submitted them this morning, according to your own public comment procedures. Would you like me to read them aloud? A man stood up from the back of the auditorium. He was in his 60s, with white hair and a commanding presence. Margaret recognized him immediately. James Holloway, a former student who now served as a state senator. I'd like to speak, if I may. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Denying a state senator the floor would not look good on the evening news, especially with the camera crews that had somehow appeared at the back of the room. Senator Holloway, Blackwell said carefully, we're honored by your presence. Please go ahead. Holloway walked to the front of the auditorium, nodding to Margaret as he passed. I graduated from Roosevelt High 35 years ago. I was a troublemaker, a kid from the wrong side of town with a chip on my shoulder and no interest in school. Mrs. Chen, who was Miss Chen back then, in her first year of teaching, saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He turned to face the audience. She stayed after school to help me with my reading. She bought me books with her own money. When I got into fights, she was the one who convinced the administration to give me another chance. Without her, I wouldn't have graduated. I certainly wouldn't have gone to college, law school, or entered public service. He turned back to the board. I'm here today because I received a phone call from a former classmate telling me that this school district was trying to force out the best teacher I ever had. And I thought, surely that can't be right. Surely our schools aren't so broken that they'd punish excellence and dedication. Davidson was sweating now. Senator, this is a personnel matter. There are procedures. There are also principles, Mr. Davidson, like fairness, transparency, accountability. Holloway's voice hardened. I've already asked my staff to look into the budget allocations at Roosevelt High over the past 2 years, the construction contracts, the vendor relationships, the pattern of experienced teachers leaving and being replaced with less qualified, lower-paid newcomers. The auditorium had gone completely silent. What I've found so far is concerning, very concerning. Gerald Foster whispered something urgently to Blackwell, who had gone pale. Perhaps, Holloway continued, the board would like to table this personnel matter while they review their own procedures, and perhaps Mrs. Chen deserves a formal apology for the way she's been treated. Blackwell stood up, her professional mask firmly back in place. The board moves to postpone the personnel review of Mrs. Margaret Chen pending further investigation. All in favor? The hands went up quickly, unanimously. Motion passed. This meeting is adjourned. The auditorium erupted in applause as Margaret's supporters surrounded her, but she noticed Davidson slipping out a side door, his phone already pressed to his ear, and she noticed Blackwell staring at her with an expression that was neither defeated nor apologetic. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. 3 weeks later, Margaret was grading papers in her classroom when Rachel Torres appeared in the doorway. You look comfortable, Rachel said, smiling. Like you never left. I never did leave. They couldn't make me, and I refused to quit. Well, you're going to want to see this. Rachel handed her a newspaper. The headline read, School Board Superintendent Resigns Amid Corruption Scandal. Margaret scanned the article. Victoria Blackwell had stepped down following revelations about kickback schemes involving construction contracts, nepotism in hiring practices, and misuse of school funds. Principal Harold Davidson was under investigation for his role in the scheme. Several school board members had announced they would not seek re-election. Senator Holloway's investigation? Margaret asked. That was the catalyst. But it went much deeper. Turns out several parents had complained about the school's finances years ago. Those complaints got buried. But when the media started digging, everything came out. Margaret set down the paper. What happens now? A lot of things. New leadership, for one. The state is appointing an oversight committee. There's talk of restoring the programs that were cut, including the arts program and expanded library hours. That's good. That's really good. Rachel sat down in one of the student desks, which was comically small for her adult frame. There's something else. Some of the former students you contacted have been talking. They want to create a foundation in your honor. The Margaret Chen Education Fund. Scholarships for students who need extra support. Grants for teachers who want to bring creative materials into their classrooms. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That's not necessary. I was just doing my job. That's exactly why it's necessary, because you never saw it as just a job. You saw it as a calling. Rachel reached across and took her hand. You changed lives, Maggie. You're still changing them. People want to honor that. Before Margaret could respond, there was a knock at the door. Marcus Williams stood there, looking uncertain. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to give you this. He walked forward and handed Margaret a folded piece of paper. It's nothing big or anything, just something I wrote. For class, I mean. But also for you. Margaret unfolded the paper and read, The Teacher. They tried to silence her voice, to dim the light she carried, but she stood firm in her classroom, where dreams are born, not buried. She taught us words have power, that books can break down walls, that one person standing for truth can answer when justice calls. They thought she was just a teacher, someone easily pushed aside, but we knew what they didn't. She's the reason we have pride. In a world that measures worth in dollars, she measured it in souls. And 20,000 students later, she's reached every one of her goals. So here's to Margaret Chen, who never backed down from a fight, who showed us that doing what's right is worth every sleepless night. Margaret looked up at Marcus, tears streaming down her face. This is beautiful, Marcus. When did you learn to write poetry? He shrugged, embarrassed. I had a good teacher. Rachel stood up and stepped toward the door, giving them privacy. But before she left, she turned back. You know what Davidson said about you being part of the old guard? He meant it as an insult, but I've been thinking about it. The old guard is what protects everything worth protecting. The values, the traditions, the knowledge that came before. Without the old guard, there's nothing to build on, nothing to pass down. Margaret wiped her eyes. That's very philosophical for a corporate lawyer. I learned from the best, Rachel smiled. See you at the foundation launch next month? I wouldn't miss it. After Rachel left, Margaret sat in her classroom as the afternoon sun painted golden rectangles on the floor. Through the window, she could see students streaming out of the building, laughing and talking, their whole lives ahead of them. She thought about the morning 30 years ago when she had walked into this room for the first time, nervous and idealistic and absolutely certain that teaching was what she was meant to do. She had been so young then, so naive about the politics and the bureaucracy and the constant fights for resources and respect. But she had never lost that certainty. Even in the darkest moments, even when they tried to push her out, she had known that what she did mattered, that every student she reached, every life she touched, every mind she opened was worth the struggle. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Chen, you probably don't remember me. I was in your class in 2008. I'm a nurse now, working in pediatric oncology. Today I held the hand of a scared little girl and told her the story of the little prince. She fell asleep smiling. I learned that story in your class. Thank you for giving me the words to bring comfort when it matters most. Lisa Martinez. Margaret smiled through her tears and typed back a simple response. I remember you, Lisa. You used to draw sunflowers in the margins of your essays. I'm so proud of you. She set down her phone and looked around her classroom one more time. The worn desks, the faded posters, the bookshelves crammed with paperbacks that had passed through hundreds of hands. They had tried to take this from her. They had tried to tell her she was outdated, obsolete, part of a past that had no place in their vision of the future. But they had been wrong, because the future wasn't built in corporate boardrooms or administrative offices. It was built here, in classrooms like this one, by teachers who believed in something more than test scores and budget projections. Margaret picked up her pen and returned to the stack of essays. Another generation of students, another chance to make a difference. And she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. 6 months after the school board meeting that changed everything, Roosevelt High looked like a different place. The hallways had been repainted. New textbooks lined the classroom shelves. The arts program was back, and the sound of students practicing in the music room filled the corridors during lunch. Margaret Chen stood in front of her advanced placement English class, holding a thick novel with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. 30 faces looked back at her, a mix of curiosity and mild skepticism that she recognized all too well. "Today we're going to talk about power," she said, setting the book on her desk. "Not political power or physical power, something more subtle, the power of narrative." A hand went up. "Is this going to be on the test?" Margaret smiled. "Everything is on the test, Jonathan. The test called life." She picked up the book again. "This is To Kill a Mockingbird. Some of you may have read it before. Some of you may think you know what it's about. But I'm going to ask you to read it differently this time. I want you to think about who gets to tell the story, whose voice is heard and whose is silenced, and why it matters." She began walking between the desks, her voice growing stronger with each step. Harper Lee wrote this book in 1960. In it, a lawyer named Atticus Finch defends a black man falsely accused of a crime in the Deep South. It's a story about injustice, about courage, about standing up for what's right, even when everyone around you says you're wrong. She paused beside a student named Maria, a quiet girl who always sat in the back row. "But here's what I want you to consider. The story is told through the eyes of Scout, Atticus's daughter, a white child. Tom Robinson, the man accused, never gets to tell his own story. We see him only through Scout's eyes, through the lens of her understanding." "So it's problematic?" another student asked. "It's complicated, like most things worth discussing." Margaret returned to the front of the room. The book is important because it challenged readers in 1960 to see injustice they might have ignored. It gave white readers a way into a story they might not have engaged with otherwise, but it's also limited by its perspective. She looked at her students. "The question I want you to wrestle with is this: can a story be valuable even if it's incomplete? Can we learn from perspectives that aren't our own? And what responsibility do we have to seek out the stories that aren't being told?" The bell rang, but nobody moved immediately. Margaret saw something in their eyes that she had seen thousands of times before. The spark of genuine curiosity, the beginning of critical thought. "Read the first 5 chapters by Thursday and come prepared to argue. I want to hear your opinions, not what you think I want to hear." As the students filed out, Marcus Williams lingered behind. He had grown over the past few months, both physically and in confidence. His writing had improved dramatically, and he had started talking about applying to colleges with creative writing programs. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you know? Back when they were trying to push you out, how did you know to fight back? Weren't you scared?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I didn't sleep for days. I thought about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways they could hurt me. But then I thought about something my mother told me a long time ago." "What was that?" "She said that fear is just excitement without breath. When you're scared of something, it usually means you care about it deeply. The fear isn't telling you to run away. It's telling you that you're standing at the edge of something important. Marcus nodded slowly. That's kinda deep. My mother was a kinda deep person, Margaret smiled. Is there something you're afraid of, Marcus? He looked at his shoes. I got into a summer writing program at Columbia. It's really competitive, but I'd have to go to New York for 6 weeks. I've never been anywhere like that. Never been around people who, actually want to be writers. And you're worried you won't fit in, that you're not good enough. He nodded. Margaret pulled his poem from her desk drawer, the one he had written for her 6 months ago. It was now framed, hanging on her wall beside thank you notes from decades of students. Marcus, you wrote this. You, a 16-year-old kid from a neighborhood where most people told you reading was a waste of time. You found words that made a grown woman cry, that made a classroom of your peers stand up and applaud, that made a state senator ask me for a copy. Senator Holloway wanted a copy? He's having it printed in his office newsletter. She handed him the frame. You are exactly good enough, and the people at that program are lucky to have you. Marcus looked at the poem, then at her. What if I mess up? What if I go there and they realize I'm not that smart? Then you'll learn something new. That's what going places and meeting people is for, not to prove what you already know, but to discover what you don't. He took a deep breath. Okay, I'll go. Good. Now get to class before Mr. Hendricks marks you tardy again. After he left, Margaret sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She had a dozen emails to answer, lesson plans to update, and a meeting with the new principal in an hour. But for a moment, she just sat and looked around her classroom. The framed poem on the wall, the thank you cards tucked into her desk drawer, the worn paperbacks on the shelves, each one a doorway to another world. This was what they had tried to take from her, not just a job or a paycheck, but this, the connections, the moments, the chance to be part of someone's story. She thought about Victoria Blackwell, now facing criminal charges for embezzlement, about Harold Davidson, who had resigned in disgrace and was rumored to be selling real estate in another state, about all the people who had thought power meant titles and money and the ability to push others around. They had never understood the real power, the kind that didn't show up on organizational charts or bank statements, the kind that built itself one conversation at a time, one student at a time, one moment of genuine connection at a time. Margaret opened the first email. A former student from the class of 2002, now a marine biologist in California, writing to tell her that she had just named her first research vessel, the Mockingbird, in honor of the book that had changed her life. She smiled and began typing her response. The new principal of Roosevelt High was a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo. She was younger than Margaret by a decade, with a warm smile and an office that she had deliberately kept modest, removing most of Davidson's expensive furniture and replacing it with comfortable chairs and student artwork. Mrs. Chen, thank you for meeting with me. Dr. Okonkwo gestured to a seat across from her desk. I wanted to discuss the mentorship program you proposed. Margaret sat down, clutching a folder of materials she'd prepared. I appreciate you considering it. I know you have a lot on your plate right now. I do. Cleaning up the mess left by my predecessor is a full-time job by itself. But this, she tapped the proposal Margaret had submitted, this is exactly the kind of initiative we should be prioritizing. The mentorship program was Margaret's idea, pairing experienced teachers with newer ones, creating a support system that would help both groups, while also preserving institutional knowledge. Too many veteran teachers had left in recent years, taking decades of experience with them, and too many new teachers burned out within 5 years, overwhelmed and unsupported. I have 15 teachers who have expressed interest in participating, Margaret said. 8 veterans and 7 newer hires. I've drafted a framework for the pairings based on subject area and teaching style. Dr. Okonkwo flipped through the materials. This is thorough. You've clearly put a lot of thought into it. Teaching has always been about more than just standing in front of a classroom. It's about passing things down. Knowledge, yes, but also wisdom. The things that can't be taught in education programs. How to reach the student who's given up on themselves. How to navigate the politics without losing your soul. How to find joy in the work even when everything around you is falling apart. The principal set down the folder and looked at Margaret with genuine curiosity. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "After everything that happened, the ambush meeting, the threats, the investigation, how did you keep going? How did you walk back into this building every day?" Margaret considered the question. "At first I was angry, then I was scared, then I was just tired. There were mornings when I sat in my car in the parking lot and seriously considered driving away, starting over somewhere else." "What stopped you?" "The students." Margaret's voice softened. "Every time I thought about leaving, I thought about them, about the kid who was finally starting to believe in himself, about the girl who had just discovered she loved poetry, about all the stories that were just beginning, that I might never see end if I walked away." She met Dr. Okonkwo's eyes. "I'm not naive. I know I'm not indispensable. Some other teacher would have helped those students if I hadn't been there. But I was there. I am here. And as long as I can still make a difference, I can't imagine being anywhere else." Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly. "You know, when the state board asked me to take this position, I almost said no. I was comfortable where I was. I had a good team, a stable school, a predictable routine. Coming here meant inheriting a scandal, rebuilding trust, facing a community that had every reason to be skeptical of administrators." "What made you say yes?" "Someone told me about you. About how you stood up for yourself and your students, about how you inspired a senator and a community to demand better. And I thought, if there are still people like that in this school, then maybe it's worth fighting for." Margaret felt tears threatening again. She had cried more in the past year than in the previous decade combined. "That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's truth." Dr. Okonkwo stood up and extended her hand. "The mentorship program is approved. Start as soon as you're ready. And if you need anything, resources, support, backup, my door is always open." Margaret shook her hand. "Thank you, Dr. Okonkwo." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen, for reminding all of us what we're supposed to be doing here." As Margaret walked back to her classroom, she passed a group of students gathered around a bulletin board. They were looking at announcements for clubs and activities, the kind of everyday school scene that she had witnessed thousands of times. But today it felt different. There was energy in their voices, hope in their gestures. The dark cloud that had hung over Roosevelt High for years was finally beginning to lift. She thought about the road that had brought her to this moment, the decades of teaching, the thousands of students, the small victories and crushing defeats. The morning when she had walked into Principal Davidson's office expecting a routine meeting and found herself fighting for her professional life. She had won that fight, but more importantly, she had learned something about herself, that she was stronger than she knew, that the connections she had built over 30 years were more powerful than any administrative scheme, that standing up for what was right, even when it was terrifying, was the only way to live a life worth living. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Torres. "Foundation raised $50,000 at the gala last night. First scholarships being awarded in spring. You should be proud." Margaret typed back, "I am, of all of us." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and pushed open her classroom door. Her next class was waiting, 30 young faces looking up at her with varying degrees of interest and boredom and hope. "Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to talk about transformation, how characters change throughout a story, how people change throughout their lives, and how sometimes the person who starts out as the underdog ends up changing everything." She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote on the board, "Who do you want to become?" That's your journal prompt for today. Take 15 minutes, write whatever comes to mind, and be honest. The only wrong answer is not trying. She watched her students bend over their notebooks, their pens moving across paper, their brows furrowed in concentration. And she thought about all the journal entries she had read over the years, all the hopes and fears and dreams that had been entrusted to her. Every single one of them mattered. Every single one of them was a story waiting to be written. And she was honored every single day to be a small part of that story. The Spring Awards ceremony at Roosevelt High was held in the newly refurbished auditorium. Fresh paint covered the walls, and new chairs replaced the rickety seats that had been there since the 1980s. A banner stretched across the stage, celebrating excellence. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion. It was dark blue, simple but elegant, the kind of thing she rarely splurged on for herself. But Rachel had insisted. "You're the guest of honor," Rachel had said. "You can't show up in your usual cardigan." The auditorium was packed. Students, parents, teachers, community members. Margaret saw faces she recognized and many she didn't. Senator Holloway was there, seated near the back, trying not to draw too much attention. Dr. Okonkwo stood near the stage, beaming with pride. The ceremony went through the usual awards: academic achievement, athletic excellence, community service. Each student who crossed the stage represented years of work and growth. Margaret applauded until her hands hurt. Finally, Dr. Okonkwo approached the podium for the final presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, our last award of the evening is a special one. It's not given every year. In fact, it's only been given twice in the history of Roosevelt High. Tonight, we give it for the third time." She unfolded a piece of paper. The Distinguished Service Award recognizes an individual who has demonstrated exceptional dedication to the students and community of Roosevelt High. Someone who has gone above and beyond the call of duty, someone who embodies everything we aspire to be as an educational institution. Dr. Okonkwo looked directly at Margaret. This year's recipient has taught at Roosevelt High for 30 years. She has touched the lives of thousands of students, many of whom are here tonight. She has weathered challenges that would have broken most people. And she has reminded us all that the true measure of a teacher is not in test scores or evaluations, but in the lives they transform. Margaret felt Rachel squeeze her hand. "Mrs. Margaret Chen, would you please come to the stage?" The audience rose to their feet as Margaret made her way up the steps. She could see Marcus Williams in the third row, clapping wildly. Lisa Martinez, who had driven 4 hours from the hospital where she worked. Rachel Torres, wiping tears from her eyes. Dr. Okonkwo handed her a crystal plaque with her name engraved on it. "On behalf of Roosevelt High School, the school board, and the community of this city, thank you, Mrs. Chen, for everything you have given us, for everything you continue to give." Margaret looked at the plaque, then at the audience. She had prepared remarks, a short speech thanking the appropriate people and expressing her gratitude, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said something else entirely. "When I started teaching, I was 23 years old and absolutely terrified. I remember standing in front of my first class, convinced that they could see right through me, that they knew I had no idea what I was doing." A few laughs from the audience. But something happened in that first year that I'll never forget. A student came to me after class one day. He was struggling, falling behind, thinking about dropping out. And I sat with him and we talked, not about assignments or grades, but about his life, his fears, his dreams. And at the end of that conversation, he looked at me and said, "You're the first adult who ever really listened to me." She paused. That student's name was James Holloway. Senator Holloway stood up from his seat, nodding, his eyes glistening. "I didn't save James. I didn't transform his life. All I did was listen. All I did was see him as a person, not a problem, and he did the rest. He transformed his own life, just like thousands of students before and after him have done. Margaret looked out at the audience, at all the faces young and old. Teaching isn't about being a hero. It's about showing up day after day and believing in young people even when they don't believe in themselves. It's about staying when it would be easier to leave. It's about fighting for what's right even when you're scared. She held up the plaque. This award isn't mine. It belongs to every student who trusted me with their struggles, every parent who partnered with me on their child's journey, every colleague who had my back when things got hard, and especially to the young people in this room tonight, who remind me every single day why I chose this profession. She took a deep breath. I'm often asked when I'm going to retire, when I'm going to finally take it easy, and my answer is always the same. I'll retire when there are no more students who need someone to believe in them, when there are no more stories waiting to be written, when this job stops feeling like a privilege. She smiled. So far that day hasn't come, and I hope it never does. She stepped back from the podium as the audience erupted in applause. People were standing, clapping, some wiping their eyes. Dr. Okonkwo embraced her warmly. Rachel was making her way to the stage with the biggest bouquet of flowers Margaret had ever seen. And in that moment, surrounded by the people she had taught and loved and fought for, Margaret Chen felt something that had eluded her during the dark days of the confrontation with Davidson and Blackwell. Peace. Not the peace of surrender, but the peace of purpose. The peace of knowing that her life meant something, that the sacrifices had been worth it, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She looked out at the auditorium one more time, at the young faces and old faces, at 30 years of relationships embodied in one room. And she thought, this is why I became a teacher. This is why I stayed. This is everything. The final day of the school year arrived with perfect blue skies and a warmth that promised summer adventures. Margaret Chen stood in her classroom, looking at walls that had been stripped of their posters and decorations. The bookshelves were empty, their contents packed away in boxes that would be reorganized in August. On her desk sat a stack of cards and small gifts from students, handwritten notes, drawings, gift cards to coffee shops. Each one she had read carefully, treasuring the words and the sentiments behind them. There was a knock on her door. She turned to find Dr. Okonkwo standing in the doorway. "Last day rituals?" the principal asked, smiling. "Something like that. It never gets easier saying goodbye, even knowing I'll see most of them in September." Dr. Okonkwo walked into the room and stood beside her. "I wanted to tell you something. I've been offered a position at the State Education Department. They want me to help develop new guidelines for administrator training." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That sounds important. Are you taking it?" "I am. But I wanted you to know that you were a big part of my decision. What happened here last year, the corruption, the way they targeted you. It happens at other schools too. Not always so dramatically, but in 1,000 small ways. Teachers being pushed out, good programs being cut, communities being failed by people who are supposed to serve them." She turned to face Margaret directly. "I want to change that. I want to build systems that prevent it, and I want to make sure that what you went through never happens to another teacher." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Patricia, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you do. Keep reminding people what teaching is supposed to look like. Keep being the example that the rest of us aspire to." They embraced, two women from different generations who had found common ground in their dedication to students. After Dr. Okonkwo left, Margaret continued her packing. She came across a journal she had kept during the dark days of her confrontation with the old administration. Flipping through it, she read entries written in anger, in fear, in despair. And she read the entry from the day of the school board meeting. "Today I learned that I am not alone. Today I learned that the relationships I have built over 30 years are stronger than any bureaucratic scheme. Today I learned that standing up for what you believe in, even when you're terrified, is the only way to live with yourself. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know who I am, and I know why I'm here." She closed the journal and placed it carefully in one of the boxes. Outside her window, she could hear students streaming out of the building for the last time, their voices raised in joy and relief. She could hear car horns and laughter and the sounds of a community celebrating the end of another year. Margaret picked up the last item from her desk, a framed photograph. It had been taken at the award ceremony, showing her standing on stage with the crystal plaque, surrounded by students and colleagues and former pupils who had become like family. In the photograph, she was smiling, not her usual polite smile, but something deeper, something genuine, the smile of a person who had found her purpose and fought for it and emerged on the other side. She placed the photograph in the box and sealed it with tape. Then she picked up her purse, took one last look around the empty classroom, and turned off the lights. "See you in September," she whispered to the empty desks. And she walked out into the summer sunshine, ready for whatever came next. The community center on Maple Street had been transformed for the occasion. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the crowd that had gathered to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the Margaret Chen Education Fund. Margaret stood near the refreshment table, holding a cup of punch that she had barely touched. She was watching the crowd, recognizing face after face. Students she had taught decades ago, now with children of their own. Parents who had become friends over years of conferences and school events. Teachers from Roosevelt High and other schools across the district. Rachel Torres appeared beside her, resplendent in a red dress that matched her confident energy. "How does it feel to be the guest of honor at your own party for the second time in a year?" "Overwhelming," Margaret admitted. "I keep thinking there must be some mistake, that someone more deserving should be standing here instead of me. That's imposter syndrome, and it's not true. Look at this room. Look at all these people who came out on a Saturday night because you made a difference in their lives." A waiter passed with a tray of appetizers. Margaret took one without really seeing it. "The foundation gave out 12 scholarships this year," Rachel said. 12 students who wouldn't have been able to afford college applications or test prep or interview clothes. 12 futures that changed because you refused to back down. The foundation is your doing, Rachel. You and the other donors. I just teach." "You just teach," Rachel laughed. "That's like saying Beethoven just played piano or that Picasso just painted. What you do is not just anything, Maggie, and it's time you accepted that." Before Margaret could respond, a young man approached them. He was in his mid-20s, with neatly trimmed hair and a nervous smile. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is David Okonkwo." "Patricia's son?" Margaret asked. "Yes, ma'am. I graduated from Wilson High in 2016. I never had you as a teacher, but I wanted to thank you anyway." "Thank me for what?" David glanced at his feet, gathering his thoughts. "When I was in high school, I was in a bad place. My dad had just passed away. My mom was working 70 hours a week. I was angry at everyone and everything. I got into trouble, almost got expelled." He looked up. "One of my teachers, Mr. Williams, he used to talk about you, about your methods, your philosophy. He said you believed that every student had potential, even the ones who seemed like lost causes. He said that belief is what made you different from teachers who just showed up and collected a paycheck." "Robert Williams," Margaret said, recognizing the name. "He was one of my student teachers back in 2008. He saved my life, Mrs. Chen. Not literally, but in every way that matters. And he told me that everything he knew about reaching kids like me, he learned from you." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I'm a social worker now. I work with at-risk youth, and every day I try to do what you taught Mr. Williams to do. See the person, not the problem. Believe in people, especially when they can't believe in themselves." Margaret took the card with trembling hands. "David, I don't know what to say. I never even met you before tonight." That's the thing about teaching, isn't it? Your influence spreads in ways you can't see, like ripples in a pond. You might never know how far they reach. He shook her hand and disappeared back into the crowd. Rachel put an arm around Margaret's shoulders. Still think you just teach? Margaret didn't answer. She was thinking about all the ripples she couldn't see, all the students she had taught who had gone on to teach others, all the lessons that had been passed down generation to generation, spreading outward in ways she would never fully know. A tap on her shoulder made her turn. Marcus Williams stood there, looking uncomfortable in a blazer that was slightly too big for him. "Hey, Mrs. Chen, you got a minute?" "For you, always." They stepped outside onto the patio, where the evening air was cool and the stars were just beginning to appear. "I just wanted to tell you something," Marcus said. "I got into Columbia, full scholarship, the writing program." Margaret's heart swelled. "Marcus, that's incredible. I knew you could do it. I knew from the moment I read your first essay." He shook his head. "You're lying. My first essay was terrible. You gave me a C- and told me I could do better." "And you did, because you worked harder than anyone I've ever taught, because you believed me when I said you had potential." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking up at the stars. "What are you going to write about?" Margaret asked. "I've been thinking about that a lot. There are so many stories I want to tell, about my neighborhood, about my family, about what it's like to grow up black in America, to be told you have to work twice as hard for half the recognition." He turned to face her. "But there's one story I have to tell first, about a teacher who fought back when they tried to silence her, about a community that rallied around her, about how one person standing up for what's right can change everything." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. "Marcus, I'm not a hero. I'm just a stubborn old woman who refused to quit." "That's what heroes are, Mrs. Chen. Stubborn people who refuse to quit," he smiled. "Can I have your blessing to write your story?" "My story isn't that interesting." "Let me be the judge of that. Besides, it's not just your story. It's all of ours. Every student you ever taught, every life you ever touched. It's the story of what education can be when people care enough to fight for it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Tell it true, Marcus. Tell the hard parts along with the good. Tell about the fear and the doubt and the nights when I thought about walking away. Don't make me into something I'm not." "I'll tell it true, I promise." They walked back inside together where the party was in full swing. Someone had put on music, and a few brave souls were dancing. Laughter echoed off the walls, mixing with conversation and the clink of glasses. Margaret found a quiet corner and sat down, letting the celebration wash over her. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The decades of teaching, the confrontation that had almost ended her career, the fight that had changed everything. She thought about Victoria Blackwell, now serving time for embezzlement, about Harold Davidson, who had reportedly moved to another state to escape the scandal, about all the people who had tried to silence her and failed. But mostly, she thought about the students, the thousands of young people who had passed through her classroom over 30 years. The doctors and lawyers and teachers and artists and parents and citizens who carried pieces of her with them, ripples spreading outward into the world. She didn't know how much longer she would teach. Her knees ached more than they used to. Her eyes weren't as sharp. Some mornings, the alarm felt like a personal insult. But as long as she could stand in front of a classroom, as long as she could see the light dawn in a student's eyes, as long as there were stories to tell and minds to shape and futures to believe in, she would be there. That was her purpose. That was her life. And she wouldn't have it any other way. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Rachel appeared with Margaret's coat. "Ready to go home?" "Almost." Margaret stood up and looked around the room one more time. "Rachel, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "When you were my student all those years ago, did you ever imagine we'd end up here? That I'd be standing at my own foundation's anniversary party, that you'd be a powerful lawyer fighting for justice, that we'd still be in each other's lives? Rachel smiled. When I was your student, I couldn't imagine being anywhere but that classroom. You made the world feel bigger than my neighborhood. You made me believe things were possible that I never would have dared to dream. She helped Margaret into her coat. But to answer your question, yes, in some way I always knew, because you taught me that relationships matter more than transactions, that the connections we build last longer than any job or title, that investing in people is never wasted. They walked out into the night together, two women bound by decades of shared history. You know, Margaret said as they reached Rachel's car, they thought they were getting rid of a troublesome old teacher. They thought I was weak because I cared about my students more than politics. They had no idea who they were messing with. Rachel laughed. No, they certainly didn't. And they still don't. Because it was never just me. It was all of us, every student, every parent, every colleague who stood up and said enough. That's what they didn't understand. They thought they were fighting one teacher. They were fighting a whole community. Margaret looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over 30 years of teaching, 30 years of triumphs and failures, and everything in between. I'm going to keep fighting, Rachel, as long as I have breath in my body, not because I want to be a hero, but because there are students out there who need someone to believe in them, and I refuse to let them down. Rachel opened the car door for her. I know you will, Maggie. I never doubted it for a second. As they drove away from the community center, Margaret watched the lights of the city pass by her window. Somewhere out there, a student was struggling with homework. A parent was worrying about their child's future. A teacher was staying late to grade papers, wondering if any of it made a difference. It did. It all did. Every moment of connection, every word of encouragement, every act of faith in another person's potential. That was the secret they never understood. The people who tried to silence her, to push her out, to make her feel small and obsolete. They saw education as a business, teachers as expendable employees, students as numbers on a spreadsheet. But education was something else entirely. It was a sacred trust, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next, a belief in the fundamental truth that every human being has value, has potential, has the capacity to grow and change and become something remarkable. Margaret Chen had dedicated her life to that belief, and no administrator, no scandal, no threat would ever take it from her. She was a teacher. She was a fighter. She was exactly who she was supposed to be. And she was just getting started. The car turned onto her street toward the small house where she had lived for 25 years. The porch light was on, welcoming her home. Tomorrow was Sunday. She would rest, read, maybe work in her garden, and on Monday she would return to Roosevelt High, to her classroom, to the students who needed her. Because that's what teachers do. They show up, they care, they believe, and they never ever stop fighting for what matters.